Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was April 3rd, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt cara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. This is episode 100, so we're going to do, in addition to a document for the day, a recap of some of what we've seen in 100 days of this podcast. But first, let's begin today's document. Today's document is on folio 98V of one of Joan's Commune registers, Register 1825. Today's document is one that I found thanks to Daniel Girona y Agostera, and it's quite fitting that on this milestone episode, episode 100, I'm working with a document from that project, that ambitious project taken on by Daniel Girona y Agostera way back in the early 20th century to identify a document from every day of the reign of Joan as part of this larger itinerary project that he did for multiple monarchs of the late medieval Crown of Aragon. So we have a document identified for almost every day. Interestingly, I just was looking at Daniel Girona y Agostera's itinerary, and I noticed that he couldn't find one for May 5th, and that's part of a larger story that we'll get to later on. But pretty much every other day, he's found at least one document. And so that's how I located this one. Sometimes it's super easy to find a document for the day. There's like 6 different ones in the registers that I can choose from. And other days I am like, thank goodness for Daniel Girona y Agostera, because there didn't seem to be anything. So he did all that work to go through the registers and find something. And he's the one that showed me that this podcast was possible, that we really could do a document from each day of a year in the reign of Joan I, and actually could do it for many different years and different kings. So he didn't do it. Girona y Agostera did not do itineraries for the queens. So trying to do a document a day for the queens, I don't quite know if that would be as possible, but my guess is that it would be. All right, so this particular document is one that appears in the register that holds a lot of general court business and administration. So this is a register that you would not find personal letters that reveal personal things, most likely. It would be more businessy. Things like legal cases and petitions. And I will say that even in the secret seal registers, which is more like the private level, not really top secret in the sense that we understand it today, in the secret seal registers, you sometimes do find businessy items, but it is mixed in with other things like personal updates, and also when they're trying to procure some luxury items, some special luxury items, that might also be in the secret seal. So this particular document is intervening in some kind of custody case. This is the first time I've seen a document regarding the custody of what seems to be a minor. So what has happened is that a man has died. That man's name is Bernard Vines, and his young daughter is the only heir. She's an heiress, to use the gendered term. And there's been some kind of maneuvering around who is taking care of her and thus has access to the inheritance money. And Joan has been alerted to some kind of problem here. There's two guys. One of them is named Garcia de Loris, and then the other has the same last name as the man who died, and that person is Francesc Vines. So perhaps that's the uncle of the daughter, whose name is Bernardona. And what's gone on here is that somehow Joan has gotten involved to the extent that he is ordering that the two men hand over Bernardona to the governor of Valencia. This is all taking place in Valencia, I think. Although, well, it is interesting because in the second line, it looks like we've got, well, the second line begins with the surname of Francesc, so that's Vines. And then it says habitadores, de, and then something like hate, Xate. So that could be Hativa. So this could be taking place in Hativa. So it's in the jurisdiction of the governor of Valencia, the province of Valencia. I really don't know how Joan got involved with this custody case, and it raises some alarming thoughts in my mind about, well, like, what is happening to this young woman? How young is she? Don't know. This could be a 5-year-old girl. I don't have any idea of what information exists about Bernardona at this time. The only information we have is that the term pubila has been used to modify the word daughter. So in line 4, we have Bernardona pubila fila e heretera de Bernard Vines. So that word is used to just indicate younger. So when the adjective pubila is, and it's used for both boys and girls. So I don't know what exact age this young woman is, but definitely she's too young to be in charge of the inheritance. So in the rest of this document, I was really hoping to find some additional information about the situation, but really it's just chocked full of enforcement language. So there's a fine, a pena, that is listed in line 13, which will be imposed if the two guys do not hand over. The word at the end of line 13 is heiress, so they are instructed to hand over la dita Bernardona al dit gobernador, the said girl Bernardona to the said governor. And then there's just more enforcement language throughout. I have to admit that my understanding of this document is cursory. So perhaps there's something in the medieval Catalan in these last 5 or 6 lines of this document that reveals a little bit more. But as I'm looking at it now, I'm really only seeing boilerplate enforcement language. And I did run this one through my process that I've been using with the large language models, Gemini and Claude, and didn't really get much further into it. Although I do have to admit that I did not pick up on the inheritance aspect of this document until I got the help from Gemini and Claude. So they were a big help. This particular handwriting, the scribe who wrote this, who I can't even tell who the scribe is, to be honest. The probata information is hard to read. The paleography, the particular handwriting quality of this scribe makes it really difficult. I did notice that further down on the page, we have another document that begins, and its header is eustem, which means likewise. So Joan wrote another letter on the same topic, and that one goes directly to the governor of Valencia, informing him of the same situation. I looked over that document, and it seemed to contain no new information. So that's today's document, and it's another instance where the monarch is getting involved in a family dispute. We've seen this a number of times with both Joan and Violante. And it gets to, I think, a good segue for taking a step back and looking at the big picture of this project. Here we are on episode 100. And if you're the kind of person that likes to count the days of the year, you might say to yourself, wait a second, this is not the 100th day of 2026. And you would be correct about that. It was April 3rd, the 100th day of 1387 in the Crown of Aragon. You'll notice that the podcast began on December 25th. And that's because the start of the new year in the Middle Ages could vary. In some places and times during the Middle Ages, the new year would actually begin in March on Annunciation Day. That would have been super confusing for the podcast, so I'm grateful that by the time we get to 1387 in the Crown of Aragon, they have decided to start the new year closer to when we start our new year in 2026. And that start for them in 1387 was December 25th. So that's why we're at episode 100 a little bit earlier than the 100th day of 2026. So that's one little detail that might be interesting to some people and tedious to others. Let's talk about something a little bit more thematic. My whole goal for researching Joan and Violante was to be able to get an understanding of what was unusual about the way that they worked together at the outset of their reign. Because in the reading that I had done about Joan and Violante, what really struck me was that even though we have this tradition in medieval Iberia of having a very strong queen, and it's actually been termed Iberian Queen Lieutenancy. We've got these strong queens, and they have legal jurisdictions that give them a portfolio and really make them like a chief executive officer for several different jurisdictions, towns, and communities in the realms. It gives them way more authority than the queens in other places. Their exercise of power is, although we have that Iberian Queen Lieutenancy, legal tradition, their exercise of power still fits in a well-established pattern for medieval elite women that they did have access to power. So this has been known in the historiography as beyond exceptionalism, where in the last 30 years, scholars of medieval elite women have observed that access to power was something that routinely happened for medieval elite women, and that it's not like, oh, there was this one extraordinary queen. It's not exceptional to see the exercise of power being carried out by elite women in the Middle Ages. At the same time, this particular case study of Violante de Bar does seem to have some really great illustrative qualities to it about what medieval elite women could do if they were presented with opportunities. And the opportunity here, I think, has a lot to do with Joan's personality and the fact that he grew up with a very strong mother. His mother, the second wife, of Pere the Ceremonious, she was very active as an Iberian queen lieutenant, although it was very clear that Joan's father was in charge. Then Joan develops a real love of French culture and is always looking eastward for his inspirations culturally, and I'd say also politically. He also develops a really strong friendship with Gaston Fébus, who's the Count of Foix-Béarn, and is mostly known for a treatise on hunting. But Gaston Fébus was also a big patron of culture and was known as the Lord of the Pyrenees. So as Joan is looking toward France and in correspondence with Gaston Fébus, he's developing this real respect and admiration for French music, French literature, and he wants to marry a French woman. And his first wife is French. He actually had an engagement previous to his first wife, another French woman, who, on her way to marry Joan, fell ill and died. So that was sad. But then Joan marries Mata d'Armagnac, and Mata and Joan had a marriage that lasted about 10 years, and Mata, unfortunately, died. And then Joan's second wife, Violante de Bar, a granddaughter of the King of France, and her uncle, the current King of France. So Violante de Bar had been raised in Paris for the most part. She certainly spent time in that region of the east of France called the Duchy of Bar, but she spent a lot of time in the court of her uncle Charles V, King of France. And it's interesting because another woman who's very well known from the Middle Ages was also there around the same time at the court of Charles V, Christine de Pizan. Christine de Pizan's father was a court astrologer for King Charles V. So there's no evidence that Violante de Bar knew or talked to Christine de Pizan, but the culture that produced Christine de Pizan, who wrote about women and power and defended the rights of women and was very instrumental in what could be seen as a kind of proto-feminism, or maybe even just feminism. It's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure what scholars of Christine de Pizan would say about that. But the same culture that produced Christine de Pizan and her outlook also produced Violante de Bar. So Violante de Bar comes to Barcelona in 1380. And at that time, she's very young. She's only about 15 years old, which was not as creepy in the Middle Ages as we would consider it today. It wasn't considered too young to be married, which is a little disturbing. And Joan was a lot older than her. So we have to kind of take a step back and just realize that when we get to 1387, Violante is still very young. She is, at this point, about 22 years old. So this is astonishing to see Violante stepping up and taking charge at a time when, in the lifespan that we, as we understand it today, we don't see many heads of state that are 22 years old. Now, the other aspect that gets me really interested in the dynamic between Joan and Violante is that not only did Joan have a heightened respect for the culture and literature of France that gave Violante an added cachet when she arrived, but there's this matter of Joan's illness and disability. And in the early days of her reign, Violante really was running the show. It's absolutely clear to me, in a way that it wasn't before the podcast started, that Joan is incapacitated for at least several days in January of 1387. And remember that Père, the ceremonious, Joan's father, had died on January 5th. Joan is not in Barcelona, where the capital is, where the seat of governance is for the realm. Violante is in Barcelona. And she moves quickly and she moves decisively to keep the reign, the brand new reign of Joan as king, intact and beyond question. So she does have some help with this. Joan's brother Martí, I'm sure, played a role, but Martí was not in Barcelona either. He was pursuing the former Queen Sibylla, who had absconded with a bunch of stuff from the royal palace. So he was pursuing her, maybe worried that she would make some kind of claim to keep the throne if things took a bad turn with Joan's illness. So Violante is absolutely integral to the establishment of this monarchy. Joan does arrive to Barcelona by the end of January, and he's healthy enough to do things, that's for sure. So the question is, what happens next? And my feeling after looking at all of the documents from the end of January to now, and when I say all, it means the ones I've looked at, there's no way that I can make it through. There's just so much documentation, and I'm sure there's gems of information hidden in there that I missed. But based on the way that I've decided to do this process of just kind of spot checking in with these documents one a day, it seems to me like Joan was very comfortable with Violante continuing to have a very dominant role in all of the important aspects of their reign. There's certain cases where Violante is not involved. There's certain cases that are in Violante's portfolio where Joan is not involved. But it seems to me like whenever something super important comes up, they're doing this together. And it is a case of co-rule. That's one of the things that I'm looking for in these documents. I have to always be careful about confirmation bias because to me it's very exciting to see this dynamic. It's very fun to trace non-conformist gender roles in this distant time and place. And so I have to make sure that I'm not, I guess, overemphasizing the moments where I see things that fit in that pattern and underemphasizing the things that don't. That brings me to the next aspect of this podcast that I think is a major theme. And that has to do not really with the content itself, but with the technological aspect of the project. And it's about AI development. So at the beginning of the podcast in late December of 2025, the AI large language models were not really at the point where I thought they could handle looking at the handwriting that we see in these documents and being able to make anything useful out of it. Perhaps I was wrong at that time. However, I would say that when we get to about February of 2026, there had been some updates that had taken place in the quality and the scale, say maybe the number of tokens for using that AI language. And by the time we get to February of 2026, it's definitely the case that the large language models are able to read the paleography, not at an expert level, and I would say you'd have to call it a rudimentary level, but they do better than the programs that, or at least one of the programs, that was constructed with handwritten text recognition as its goal. And I'm referring to Transcribus. So before 2026, I thought that Transcribus would be the place where I would actually get to have automated text recognition working for this paleography. And I'm still, I could do a little bit more work on Transcribus, but I had input 60 documents worth, 60 pages worth of ground truth data that I had ensured were exact transcriptions. And even with that, Transcribus could not generate even rudimentary text. It would come through as not even more than a couple words in each document that were correct. Now, the large language models, Gemini and Claude, they each do better than Transcribus does. And that's not even with any ground truth data. Like, the whole idea of Transcribus is that you program your algorithm. So, maybe it's not a fair comparison. The exact technological details are impossible to know because all of the programs that I've just been discussing, Transcribus, Gemini, Claude, they don't make their model publicly viewable. It's what's known as a black box. You're not able to look inside. You're not able to really see how it works. So that's one of the major objections that a lot of the digital medievalists have to Transcribus, and that's why they sometimes will advocate for eScriptorium, because that one you can look inside and see how it works. All of this is to say that at the beginning of the podcast, I did not perceive that I would be using AI quite so much. And now, when we're at episode 100, I've started to experiment with agentic AI, where you let the AI run on your own machine, have access to your own machine. And I do not recommend this for people unless they can get a separate laptop, because you don't want to let the AI run wild on a machine that has things like your tax returns on it or something like that. So, I'm starting to experiment with OpenClaw, which is the most prominent of the programs that allows an AI to have access to what's on your local device. And so with that process, I was able to automate the processing of entire registers. So what I have been doing for the last month or so is taking just the document of the day, the image of it from Pares, and inputting it into Gemini, having Gemini do its best to transcribe, and then I start over with Claude, have Claude do its best to transcribe that image of the document, and then I take what Gemini produced and I paste that into the chat with Claude, and then Claude does a reconciliation. I then look that over and give some corrections, and then Claude does a third round and also produces an English language translation. So that's what you've been seeing on a lot of the web pages for the episodes in March, especially. Now, OpenClaw allowed me to set up a program where I had an entire register, like 300 images, fed through that process, all in succession without me having to do any clicking around. The really important piece that's missing from that is the stage 3 moment. Right before stage 3 with Claude, I would look it over and notice, okay, you're just really getting this important word wrong, and it appears a bunch of times in the document, so I'm going to give you a correction there. That's been very helpful. And I can't do that if the entire register is being run through in an automated way. So the quality is not as good as when I tackle these one at a time. But what does get generated is this vast amount of information that is still usable. And and that's really the best I can say about it. I mean, I think there's a lot of problems with it, but it does hold up when you're doing certain searches, and I'm still working on it. Just started that process in the last couple days, and so I'm still trying to evaluate the quality of what's produced there. But we're talking about AI agents now, and that whole thing wasn't really even on the radar of people who would use AI back in like November of 2025. So there's just been this tremendous step forward, and if there's more steps forward like that, of that magnitude, as we go through 2026, like every couple months there's a big leap like that, it's going to be really interesting to see what's happening with the way that historical researchers can use AI over the upcoming years. It's going to be quite a lot of changes. So this podcast, in a way, is a journal of using AI in its early days. Okay, we are way beyond the usual episode length. That's okay, because it's episode 100. It's a great milestone. It's important to check in and explain some of the overall important themes of the podcast project. I want to thank everybody who's been sticking around for all these episodes. It's the kind of podcast that doesn't have a lot of suspense, I guess, sometimes, because there's a lot of humdrum, It's just day to day doing the business of governance sometimes. So if you've been listening all along, you've got quite a tolerance stamina for for history. And if you haven't, it's fine. The podcast is not really intended to be listened to every day. It's intended to be more of a journal, a diary, a notebook. And so the interesting stuff, the most interesting stuff, really might be what comes at the end, and how we can look back on this day-to-day notebook that chronicles how a historian approaches trying to understand the past, how a historian works with documents from a distant time and distant place in order to try to create some kind of argument or narrative. And that's why the podcast is called the Historian's Notebook. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, like, what's going to happen with AI? Oh my gosh, Shadow. And there's Shadow making an appearance again. That would no milestone episode would be complete without a little contribution from little Shadow Cat. All right, if you're leaving with more questions than you arrived with about AI, about Joan and Violante, well, I've done my job. Because remember, the motto of the Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. If you listen or read some work of a historian and you are left completely satisfied, like all questions have been answered, then I think that author has done something wrong. Because my belief is, and Shadow too, is that good history opens up even more questions all the time. Because the exact nature of the past is unknowable. We can only make strong arguments based on evidence, and when you do that, inevitably, more questions arise about what is missing and what is not in the evidence that survived. All right, visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and to listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.